thanks for coming today. Really excited about today's event. My name is Bahar. I represent the SAIS Diversity Council, and we are co-hosting the event today with the International Law Society. So we have Samuel and Daphne, who are also leaders of the organization. Thank you so much for all of your help. Today we're commemorating United Nations Day with a discussion on identity, statelessness, and the right to a home. There's various articles within the UN Declaration of Human Rights that point to the right to a home. For example, Article 15 states, everyone has the right to a nationality, and no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality nor denied the right to change his nationality. Leading the discussion today will be DaQuan Lawrence, a human rights activist and our own 2018 SAIS International Law graduate, and author Martine Kalaw, who has written extensively on her own experience as stateless. They're also personal friends of mine, so I'm very excited to have them together. We'll also hear from board members of United Stateless, who are all here on the front row. It's an organization dedicated to advocacy and community empowerment for stateless people. So let DaQuan take over. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody, once again. Can everybody hear me in the back? I just want to make sure that I'm projecting. So once again, my name is DaQuan. As Bahar just mentioned, I literally just completed my studies here at SAIS last year. I have somewhat of a, a unique story because I actually started as an MA student in 2014, concentrating in international law and conflict management. However, because of my familial status and my background in foster care, which I'll get to later, I actually had to transition from a full-time student to a part-time student, and I wasn't able to complete my studies until last year. But be that as it may, I'm extremely happy to be here with you all. Without further ado, what led me to SAIS was my interesting background, and due to the context of this conversation with Martine and I guess we could possibly maybe offer perspectives of maybe an international statelessness and also domestic statelessness, and what that looks like as me being a former foster care youth who also experienced homelessness, being a welfare recipient, living on social services, the whole nine. So again, with that being said, my origins in foster care began in Harlem, New York, which is where my mom is from. My mom had me when she was a teenager in foster care, and my father was also a teenager. He was 15, my mom was 16, and because of my father's and mother's decisions, I ended up, kind of having an experience as a nomad, if you will. As a youth, I bounced around from place to place, moving officially 10 times before I was 10 years old, and I had stints in Harlem, New York, the Bronx, New York, Brooklyn, New York, Dobbs Ferry, New York, Peekskill, New York, Yonkers, New York. If anybody's familiar with the New York area, this is right. So this is again, this is based in Westchester, upstate, as well as again in the city. And again, all of this is due to my, unique familial status, where I was connected to my family, but estranged at the very same time because of my mom's experience and my father's experiences as a youth. Be that as it may, my experiences shaped me, and if anybody knows anything about Harlem, it is an extremely diverse but also culturally rich place. So one thing I remembered, even though I bounced around from place to place, it was extremely important for me to be, you could say, internationally conscious, but also involved in the affairs of the African diaspora. So I grew up, looking up to individuals like Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, the list goes on and on and on. Both individuals who, quote unquote, look like me or come from my community, whatever that means, as well as individuals who aren't considered necessarily African descendants or African Americans, if you will. But so long story short, after moving around from New York, my mom, we could say, matriculated out of social services, and she ended up having her case moved from New York to Maryland, where I completed high school, then attended university, and while I was in undergrad, somehow, some way, I could say, or what I like to say is that my experiences in poverty shaped my interest in public policy. And once upon a time, I don't know if Professor Schneebaum actually knows this, but once upon a time I wanted to be a lawyer. So I realized, based again on my experiences, but that I didn't necessarily have the heart or the conscience to be a lawyer. and I kind of narrowed it down to either defending the guilty or convicting innocent people. And I couldn't necessarily stomach it. Be that as it may, I was extremely interested in international law, international policy. That led to me coming to SAIS, and I guess the rest is history. I've been in the city for the past 5 years now, extremely active in a bunch of community-based organizations, international organizations. We could talk about my perspective on human rights activism and stuff like that later. But one of the most important things to me that I did actually right before attending SAIS, I went to school in Baltimore, Maryland, and because of my experiences and because of my awareness of the social, political, economic conditions in America, I started a nonprofit entitled Strong Men Overcoming Obstacles Through Hard Work. It's an acronym for SMOOTH, and the organization, the mission is to educate, develop, organize, and empower African American males and youth while they're in public schools or in college. So basically we try to facilitate again, cultural events, social events, professional development events, social skills, help them, whether it pertains to academia or just life. Because me, again, as a quote unquote, marginalized individual, as a black man, again, who experienced the things that I've experienced in my past, we have a range of things that we could build upon in terms of, again, group thinking, collectivism, in terms of, again, ameliorating poverty, being active in our community, and what I would like to do is, again, inspire more people to be active in public policy, people, again, who look like me. So with all of that being said, that I would say is the context for, my experience and why I'm here to introduce Martine, who is, I think, going to offer a phenomenal perspective of, again, like what it not only means to be, stateless or undocumented, but again, in terms of international, identity or mental health and what it means to, again, be a part of a community, both abroad and domestically. So I'm going to read Martine's bio without further ado. So Martine Kalaw is an author, speaker, and commentator on the human aspect of current immigration laws and policies. She's also an undocumented immigrant survivor. Her novel, which I hold in my hand, Illegal Among Us, A Stateless Woman's Quest for Citizenship, recounts her journey of going from a 7-year battle in deportation proceedings without a family or country to a senior level executive with an advanced degree, a father, and U.S. citizenship. Martine contributes her voice to the immigration conversation in the following ways: providing practical tools for undocumented immigrants on how they can educate and dignify themselves in order to navigate between lawyers and the courts, commenting on the human component of immigration laws and policies specifically related to whom she refers to as silent dreamers, further marginalized individuals who don't necessarily qualify for the DACA, and stateless persons. She's in the process of creating her own foundation to replicate the 3 resources that sustained her as an undocumented immigrant to other individuals in circumstance. And Martine was also featured as a speaker on immigration reform at various forums and rallies, such as Senator McCain's town hall rally on immigration in New York City in February 2006. And May 18th of 2007, Martine was a panelist and a speaker to the U.S. House of Representatives Judiciary Subcommittee's hearing on immigration reform, where she shared her story and spoke on behalf of the DREAM Act. Martine has also written for publications like the Huffington Post, is a TEDx speaker, and has appeared on syndicated networks like C-SPAN. She has spoken at the Brookings Institution, which is obviously right across the street, in honor of World Refugee Day in June 2019. She is also a 2019 recipient of the American Heritage Award, where she shares this honor with noteworthy individuals such as General Colin Powell, Sammy Sosa, and Carlos Santana. She speaks at colleges, universities, and companies on the theme of leadership, investing versus helping, empathy, and/or immigration. Martine is a graduate of Hamilton College and Syracuse University's Maxwell School with a Master's of Public Administration and a focus on immigration law. Martine is also an organization development expert with over 10 years of experience designing management and leadership programs, as well as training manuals. As a managing principal of Martine Kalaw Enterprises, she consults and trains with global startups who are on the verge of an M&A, sudden growth, or are downsizing. Please help me welcome Martine to the SAIS community. So the format of today's conversation is obviously we're going to try to make this as informal as we can. We would like for this to be a conversation amongst all of us, all of the participants in this room. We really benefit from the intimate setting, and We're gonna start with conversations and questions from me to Martine. I'll also offer my perspective where I believe that I can offer some perspective, and then we'll wrap up with guest speakers from United Stateless. And if anybody has any questions, we would love to I guess to host them or to field them, if you will. So our first question, my first question for Martine rather. Considering the bio that I literally just read, and everyone's knowledge of what it means, again, to be a stateless individual, Martine, I would like to know your opinion on the distinctions and similarities among marginalized populations with relative political minority status. So, for example, maybe individuals who endure identity denial or suppression, experience hardship obtaining citizenship, experience statelessness, homelessness, undocumented immigration, or foster care status, as each pathway can lead to an estrangement from family, being rendered nationless or classless, and forced into institutional nomadic living.
Okay, I'll try to remember. Before that, I'm hoping that I can, just kind of elaborate a little bit more on my story and give a little bit more context to my journey and going from where I was to where I am today. And then I can answer that question if you don't mind repeating it. Thank you. Perfect. I just want to thank you all for having me. It's an honor to be at the SAIS with the SAIS community, as well as having United Stateless here, as well as having DaQuan leading this conversation. I felt really strongly about coming here today and speaking on behalf of United Nations Day in honor of the idea of everyone deserving a home. My story of finding a home or in search of a home started when I came to the United States when I was 4 years old. I came from Zambia, which is where I was born, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was formerly Zaire. My mother and father were from that country. I came to the US when I was 4 years old with my mother. Most of my mother's family lived here, actually in the Maryland, DC area, and we came to pursue the American dream. We came on a visitor's visa. I was a little photo in the back of my mother's passport. Thankfully, that nowadays even minors and children have their own passports. As you can see from my story, what you'll see from my story is it creates a lot of complications when that does not happen. So I came to the United States. I had a relatively normal childhood, and when I was 12 years old, I'll backtrack a little bit. My mother remarried. She remarried an American citizen, American-born citizen, who became my stepfather. Had a relatively normal childhood. We moved from Maryland to Ohio when I was 12 years old because my stepfather became ill. When I was 13, my stepfather died, and a year and a half later, my mother died. So in that light, I became an orphan. And while I cannot speak to the challenges and the depths of challenges of being in foster care, I feel that my experience of being orphaned, was similar in a lot of veins, because I had to bounce from one home to another for a myriad of 2.5 to 3 years. So in the year and a half, actually, after my mother passed away and my stepfather passed away, I moved from 5 different homes in 5 different states and cities, and went to 3 different schools. And I experienced abuse in some of those households, and these are the households of family members, my mother's family members. And there's a very long story of how I ended up in boarding school. Some people call it luck, some people call it angels, and some people call it the randomness of life. But essentially, I ended up in boarding school because of the kindness of a stranger, actually 2 strangers. And the second stranger was a judge in Charlottesville, Virginia, who decided to be my benefactor. He and his wife decided to be my benefactor and pay my way through boarding school. So, again, it was a matter of just surviving and doing my best. And I really believed, and what was instilled in me from the time I was a little, young child, was the importance of education. If you study and you work hard, you get far, and that's what I believed. So I got into Hamilton College, but that is when another shoe dropped. I guess I would say the second shoe. The first shoe was the loss of my mother and father. The second shoe was when I found out that I was undocumented. That's another long story which is elaborated in my book, but essentially it was right before, around 9/11, where I went to the Social Security Administration and I was immediately placed in removal proceedings. That's a really nice euphemism for deportation proceedings. And at the time, talking about euphemisms, the term of being undocumented didn't exist. You were just an illegal alien. And and trying to navigate the space of being undocumented in this space in the context of the war on terror, which was what was, the label of the time, and also trying to balance being a normal student, right? Many of us in this room are students, and not wanting to be found out, right? So there was a lot of shame, there was a lot of fear. I could not trust anyone. I didn't know who would, tell on me and out me if I did reveal my status to people. I didn't understand how I could have ended up in this situation. And I was also dealing with the remnants of losing my mother and father. I mean, these are things that were still going on in my mind. And I was placed in removal proceedings and redirected to the courts in Buffalo, New York. And the way that immigration law and courts work, to this day, because I mentor other individuals, I go to court with them. I sometimes, it's really hard because you have to relive the trauma, but judges have reputations. If you get this judge, things might work out. If you get this judge, you're in trouble. Like, that's the worst thing that can happen to you. And guess what judge I got? The second judge, the judge that was known to have a horrible reputation, who was removed from the Miami courts. He wasn't disbarred, but he was removed from the Miami courts just to go to a different court system. So that is also what I learned when I was placed in removal proceedings and was in this courtroom, that I was also stateless, because this judge was on this vendetta to get rid of me. I like to think of it, the way I remember it is I felt like he wanted to annihilate me. He really did not like me. I aggravated him. I believe some of it had to do with the way in which my attorney represented my case. A lot of things were brought forth to the courtroom in the 11th hour. That certainly did not make this judge happy. He felt like I was offending the court, that I was lying, and all of these things. And so he was on this crusade to annihilate me, get rid of me. Wherever I could go, he didn't care. So the realities were, the country that I was born in, Zambia, would not accept me, right? Because there was a point in which I would have had to claim citizenship, which I didn't know about, so I wasn't a citizen of Zambia. DR Congo did not acknowledge me as a citizen, even though my mother and my biological father were from DR Congo, partially because DR Congo used to be Zaire. It changed its government, and also because I didn't adjust or claim status at a certain age. So I didn't qualify for being a citizen of either of those countries. The United States didn't want me. So what happens to individuals like myself who end up in deportation proceedings? Well, you can end up in a detention facility indefinitely, which was my greatest fear, because I didn't know what happened after that, right? What happens to people who are just in detention indefinitely? The other option that I thought was somewhat ironic at the time was they were looking for a third country to send me to. So a country that will just take me, right? That's what they do sometimes to individuals who have no country, who might be stateless, and they just want to get rid of them. Where can we send them? The irony was they were considering sending me to Mexico at the time, so I just find that to be a little bit ironic. But I want to just kind of walk you through the psyche of someone who's going through something like this. It was utter fear and terror, right? Because you're being told that you don't exist. All the things that define a person, I didn't have. I didn't have a country, I didn't have a family, nor did I have a status, right? So in truth, I felt like I was a nobody, I didn't exist. And then I was walking into a courtroom probably every 2 months, hearing someone tell me, a judge, right, and ICE telling me that I was a nobody, that I deserved to be deported, I deserved to be sent off somewhere. And then the reality was, well, what happens to me? Am I gonna die in a detention facility? And this was my life for 7 years, and having to balance that along with just trying to survive every day. Like, how am I gonna feed myself? How am I gonna clothe myself, right? So these were the realities that we all face every day, but you couple that with you're fighting for your life, and you're also fighting for your sanity, right? Because when you're being told you don't exist every day, and you have to go on, well, what do? You have to be composed. You have to keep going. Well, how do you do that? And luckily for me, and this is something that I really, stress, and this is the kind of work I'm trying to do with others, is provide mental health support. So at the time, I was able to get mental health counseling, which is what allowed me to sustain myself throughout that journey. It was having my forensic psychologist who actually, diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And I emphasize that as well because when we think about all of these children that are walking into these courtrooms by themselves, they have no one, and they're minors. I mean, I was 18, I was 19, and I was diagnosed with PTSD. I would shiver, I would get sick before every court hearing. I cannot imagine a child, a minor, having to do that on their own. Statistically speaking, 85% of individuals that have been in detention facilities or have been detained do not have legal representation, right? Because immigration courts don't fall under the judicial system. They fall under the executive branch. So this was my reality, this was my fear, and my case went to the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is the highest immigration court, twice. The first time, the Board of Immigration Appeals, which are known for the extensive backlog and not reviewing cases, sent it back, and they're actually based in Falls Church, Virginia. They sent it back to the judge and said, no, deal with the case and figure it out, review the case some more. The judge was further angered, sent it back to the Board of Immigration Appeals, and mind you, this was over the course of 7 years. And that is when the unthinkable happens, and even to this day, I sat in a room and I've spoken to a room of 800 immigration attorneys. I've spoken to individuals who've been in removal proceedings, and they don't understand how this happened. But the Board of Immigration Appeals actually reviewed my case. I mean, this is it's 1 in 5,000 chances of this happening. They reviewed my case. They gave a 6-page response as to why I deserve to be in the United States. They remanded it back to the judge, and they forced him to close the case and grant me permanent resident status. That is unheard of. That is the only reason that I am here today. And the reality is that my situation was a fluke, right? I mean, when I speak to rooms of individuals who are going through or have gone through my similar circumstances, and they ask me, Martine, how do you do it? How can you replicate what you did? I cannot promise them that I can guarantee the same outcome. What I can promise and what I can provide them are means to sustaining themselves as they're going through it. Because the system is so broken now that there aren't no remedies, there aren't any prescriptions to getting to the other end of things. And that's precisely why we're here today. And so I really, in terms of homelessness or not having a home, I experienced it on so many levels as an individual who didn't have family and navigating through the space of no family, as someone who was stateless and not having a country to claim as their own, and someone who was undocumented and being afraid fearing being deported or being in detention indefinitely. And these are the realities that many people are going through today, and unfortunately their outcome may not look the way mine does. So with that, if I can ask you to repeat that question.
So actually, I honestly think that I may not have to repeat the question because I think you may have actually touched on what I was trying to get at. And with that being said, I think thank you again for elaborating and sharing your powerful story. Again, I think as many of us know, or maybe some of us may not necessarily be aware, I think we have several populations internally or domestically within America that experience marginalization for various reasons. So it could be because of racial or ethnic identity, it could be because of political status, it could be because of social status, but oftentimes, more times than not, it's because of economic status, which can also, I would say, possibly be a conflation of the other two, conditions in terms of social and political. But with that being said, again, like we touched on, homeless populations, individuals like myself who experience, foster care status, I would probably, again, like I said, like to consider us, the domestic, displaced, or not necessarily stateless, because again, we have nationality, but again, depending on, your story or your, specific, perspective and background, you may not, again, necessarily be connected to your family. You may not necessarily have an ID. Again, I know my mother being one of them, former displaced individual and again, homeless person, many individuals who are currently homeless, who possess jobs, also don't, and it may be again a contradiction, they may not necessarily possess jobs, but they also don't have IDs, so they can't necessarily vote. So it's very hard as a homeless person to exercise your right to vote in this country when, again, you are kind of basically being overlooked or, discounted or again, marginalized in terms of the political process due to economic and social reasons.
If I could just say something related to that, we look at, like you said, homelessness, individuals in foster care. I think, the numbers are like, they're, on a given day, there are 400,000 individuals in the foster care system or children in the foster care system. There are 12 million stateless individuals in the world. There 25% of the homeless population is in Los Angeles alone. I mean, these numbers are staggering. And one of the things I think about as it relates to why we're here today, and the UN article that Bahar read is, within these marginalized communities, there seems to be, our bodies are offensive to others, right? We're almost like in the way, right? And so there's this need to kind of put these communities, these marginalized, tuck them away somewhere so they're not offending the general public. And the other thing that I want to say related to that is that they kind of feed into each other. They're sort of a domino, right? If we don't address one category, they can feed into the other. I mean, statelessness, homelessness, being undocumented, like there can be a domino, in all those categories. And just had a conversation a little bit earlier this week around human trafficking. So there's a preponderance of children in all those categories of marginalized communities that we're talking about that are likely to be trafficked, and that's a number that's increasing, and it's also staggering.
Once again, I think as we can see, and we'll consider this a little bit later, I think that there are several reasons why this is not only necessarily an important human rights issue, but in some ways, when it comes to policy, I like to think about, as you mentioned, again, like the populations that are directly affected, but then also the populations that are maybe indirectly affected. So it makes me think about an MLK quote, who, I'm pretty much paraphrasing what he said. One of his motivations for helping other individuals was because if he didn't necessarily help other individuals, then they would possibly, lead to a path where they could possibly, lead to his demise, or they could become an enemy or somebody who opposed him. So again, it's always a wise idea to help your neighbor or a neighboring population, or someone considered a refugee, or somebody considered homeless, or somebody considered destitute, or somebody considered an untouchable, whatever it may be. Again, like due to international context or your local or regional context, I think it's always important to look at the baseline of humanity. So no matter what, whether we have homes, whether we again have quote unquote nationalities, or whether our nationalities and homes are recognized via an institution or not, we are still people, and everybody again is important. And me being the human rights activist that I am, one of the I guess credos or mottos that I like to say is every person has a soul and every soul has a purpose. So again, here we are at SAIS, 7.5 billion people on the earth and counting. And again, even though this is again, the left is the middle to me, so that's my disclaimer before I continue. Even though here we are again, where people like to work with economists or study economics, and the theory of the day is scarcity, and the scarce resources and overpopulation, and the fact that we need to appropriate this so this population has this and there's the have and have-nots. Again, based on my experience, based on me being a SAIS graduate, my perspective and the paradigm that I prescribe to, which is again denying social, political, and economic inequalities, no matter which organization, whether it's the UN, IMF, World Bank, etc., is acknowledging it, and again, just acting as a human, as somebody on a human basis. So with that being said, I would like to go back to Martine, and with the story that you shared, I would like to again, just commend you and thank you for sharing again. You're very young, your life story, work, and efforts are enlightening, inspiring, and very insightful. Do you have any, I guess we could say, lessons learned that we could share with not only our audience and the students, but the international community to not only necessarily become involved, but again to kind of, I guess maybe a call to action, or how we could, incorporate, your experience or share your experience to again be effective and help other individuals?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think earlier in the bio you mentioned that my TEDx talk, which is on investing versus helping, and this is something that I really believe in and I share with any community that I speak to. And let me elaborate a little bit on that. And I do believe that it can lend itself to the international community and other governing bodies. I really, when I work with marginalized populations, people from my community, what I encourage them to do is, really look for people to invest in them rather than help them. And vice versa, so individuals that reach out and are looking to, who have the resources and the tools and the time and they want to give back, how can they do it? They can either help or they can invest. And the distinction I make around investing versus helping is, the idea of like sponsoring versus offering aid, right? And the whole theme and idea of aid is pretty prevalent in the international community, especially as it relates to human rights. When I think of aid and I think of helping, I think of an imbalance of power, and it's usually short-lived. It's assuming that one person has power and is more superior, and the other does not. So let me help you. Let me give you this charity, and it's short-lived, and it really, I personally don't feel that the person who is helping the other individual necessarily sees him or her. And when you think about it, sometimes when we're giving charities to a certain cause, do we really know where that money is going? Right? We're just giving it, right? And there's no follow-up. And so I really believe that the person who is offering should bear also the responsibility of following through. And so that's why I really believe in this whole idea of investing. And investing doesn't have to be financial. It can be time, it's the idea of mentorship. So this is how I got to where I got to. It started with that benefactor in boarding school who wanted to help me, right? That was, he and his wife's idea was, let's give her money, let's help her get, finish boarding school, go through boarding school, and did not want me to know who he and his wife were, right? So that was really from the perspective of, let me help her, and and we can maintain this distance. But what I will people to do is to invest in me. Like, no, you're not going to just help me. I'm not charity. I am a person. You're going to see me. We're going to have a relationship, and there's something you're going to get out of this too. Like, it's not that you're superior to me. So I really want anyone I mentor, I really try to instill that value in them. That's literally what has gotten me to where I am today. To this day, that's just how I live my life. And I really, when I have people reach out to me and say, well, how can I help? How can I, help this community? I'm like, well, you can be an investor, and this is how you can begin doing that. So that's, one thing. And along those lines, it's the savior complex, right? When people want to support others, I really think that sometimes, certain individuals assume this sort of superiority, this savior-like complex of, let me help these poor people. And I particularly, I actually had a conversation with, resource providers. Sometimes it's immigration lawyers or lawyers themselves, right? It's really a lack of maybe empathy, and sometimes not actually seeing the other person who's sitting across from you, right? Seeing them as a case, as a situation, but not as a person. And so these are the two things that I look to share with others, and help to kind of break down and dismantle so we can have more of a symbiotic relationship between the giver and the receiver.
once again, thank you for sharing. A lot of your comments just, again, made me just think about, I'm gonna speak a little louder because of the machine. A lot of your comments just made me think about, again, my experiences, again, as an activist and what I try to urge people to do in terms of, interacting with other individuals, which is, I would say, in my estimation, this is gonna be paraphrasing, but avoiding the objectification of people, which again, like when we talk about, I guess it's as simple as saying, there's ways to dehumanize individuals, and people, because of, not necessarily because of the quote unquote political regime now in America. I'm someone who liked to talk about classism and racism and xenophobia when President Obama was president. So I'm not, again, like I said, the left is the middle to me. So I'm not someone who's like, oh, Trump is president, the sky's falling, let's help marginalized people, let's help poor people, now we need to unite because quote unquote Trump is in office and he invented racism, because he didn't invent racism. He didn't create all of these problems. And the way that I like to look at it, again, I would go off on a tangent and I'll probably bore you, but I think that we're all culpable, we're all responsible. Our United States citizenry, for those of us who are citizens of the United States, for the status quo. And again, the political, social, and economic status quo. And again, like I said, that was prior to Trump being in office. Again, like I said, a lot of people like me were struggling when Obama was in office. That's something I would love to speak to him or anybody in his administration about. And again, like I'm not, like it's not like the fact that he looked the way he looked and the whole identity politics game and he represented whatever he represented, which was supposedly a post-racial America, which does not exist, that bothered me. And a lot of people were just happy that he was quote unquote black or he was quote unquote an African descendant. And that's something that, again, I'm not satisfied with that. But to wrap it all up and bring it back to this conversation, again, I speak to that because I'm talking about dehumanizing and objectifying individuals. And it happens, as I would like to say, via policy, but it also happens, again, on a day-to-day, more, humane interaction and, when, again, it's not on a necessary institutional level. And to speak to your second point, I guess, about the, what I would describe as, like the savior complex or the white knight complex or whatever. I think a lot of that really has to do with like hegemonic influence. And again, as an American, I'm speaking to somebody like, I failed to mention another part of the reason that I'm here today is because as an international law concentrator, I participated in the 2016 Human Rights Clinic, which focused on the current situation of statelessness, migration, and deportations in Haiti and Dominican Republic. So we can speak about that later, but there's several obviously data, statistics, and there's a whole story about the ongoing situation. But while I was in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, it was extremely interesting that my American citizenship benefited me because I was an American, but at the same time, because I had longer hair, way longer hair then, but because I looked Haitian, I too was ostracized, and I too was suspected of being El Haitiano, or expected too of being someone who shouldn't have been traveling with our research team of other SAIS students. And because again, like the only reason I'm here today to tell the story is because I'm an American, or because again I had other SAISers there to tell the story. And again, this is something that I actually blogged about. Like, would they have believed me if I was alone? And I had all of my materials, and I had my passport, and I had, documents stating that this is why I'm in Haiti, and this is why I'm in the Dominican Republic. Like, would they believe me? Who knows? With that being said, Martine, in addition to being a member of marginalized populations, you are also a phenomenal woman and an African descendant, which can conflate the difficulties you experience or experienced, especially in America. Can you please share how your status among the intersections of marginalized populations have affected you, helped you, and prompted your professional efforts?
Yeah. Yes. So I would, I feel that I fall into so many different marginalized groups. I define myself, or identify myself as obviously I'm Black, I'm African, I was undocumented, I'm stateless, I'm a woman. Right? There are all these different categories, and I am a minority within a minority within a minority, and sometimes that can feel very bleak. Not the association of groups that I'm associated with, but the perceptions, the negative perceptions that are associated with those groups. So it can feel very heavy. But to your question, there was a time where I felt like I had to pledge an allegiance to one group over another, right? And what I mean by that is you talked a little bit earlier about the scarcity idea of scarcity, and within marginalized communities, and we see this, you know, throughout history, throughout the world. You know, when you're part of a marginalized community, you know, there's a tendency to create factions, so no one's at the very bottom, right? And so, and what ends up also happening when these factions are created is that there's this competition because there's this idea of scarcity. And so, you know, I've experienced that as being, you know, in the US, when people look at me, I'm African American, right? Although I'm also African, and you know, not everyone would have known that I was undocumented, but I was also undocumented. But sometimes these marginalized communities, because they're at odds with each other. So there was a time, historically, I think this was maybe 5 years ago, now it's getting better, where there was this idea or this myth that was being perpetuated and perpetuated so that African Americans historically felt like they were in competition with undocumented immigrants for jobs, right? And so there was this, and it was the media, it was a lot of different people that was creating this divide, right? And I was in the middle of it because I'm undocumented, I was undocumented, and I was also Black, I'm also African American. So which allegiance do you know, pledge to, right? And so it was really difficult. And what I realized is that I cannot pledge allegiance to just one. I am all of these people. I sit in the intersection of all of these identifiers. These are all the things that make me who I am. I think I actually also realized that even when I went back to Zambia just a few years ago, 5 years ago, I went back to Zambia. In Zambia, everyone referred to me. They're like, "You're American. You're American. You're not African. You're not." I'm like, "Wait, I'm one of you. I was born here, right?" And in America, people are like, "They always ask me, where are you from? Where are you from? Where are you from?" Right? So I have decided that I am not going to let other people define me. I'm just going to, you know, define myself. And so I now see myself as more like a chameleon or an ambassador, if you will. I think that when these communities, just like the communities we talked about earlier, the homelessness community, foster care, stateless individuals, undocumented immigrants, while they're very unique in their struggle and their journeys, there are some parallels. And if we can come together, these communities can come together, find the similarities, and unite in the conversation, we might be able to move forward faster, you know, quicker, and more effectively. So I feel that I can be this sort of chameleon and this sort of ambassador and move around from one idea, one community to another, and share the messages and the messaging. So that's kind of how I am now, and I find that feels right for me. It may not necessarily be right for other people, but this is what works for me.
Thank you for your answer. So with that being said, I would just like to share my thoughts before we pivot. I think that, again, I would be remiss if I did not say that it's my profound belief that, again, like, despite social, political, and economic status, that we being humanity all have way more in common than anything that separates us. Like, we all experience the same emotions at different times and respond completely differently. And that's due to our experiences. Like, I mean, again, it's obvious, but I don't think that we really concentrate on this enough, but I'm a really introspective person, so I think a lot. But we are the culmination of our experiences. So the same way that I think it's really foolish to judge someone based off of, you know, their economic, you know, affluence or destitution, or, you know, it's silly to judge someone off of the, you know, the texture of their hair, the color of their skin. Like, it really doesn't matter, because when we get, you know, to know each other, again, like, despite political ideology or, again, like, economic backgrounds, there are, like, so many things that we could build upon to work together and to help one another. Again, whether you're somebody who, you know, is a part of a hedge fund and you're running a company, or whether you're not, whether you're just a quote-unquote struggling lawyer trying to make it, or whether you're someone that's a stateless individual. Like I mentioned before about everybody having a soul and every soul having a purpose, we all have dreams, ideas, and, you know, aspirations. You know, so the fact that somebody, you know, is considered, you know, disadvantaged or poor or disabled, you know, again, all of these qualifiers and quantifiers that we use to label humans, I think they really distract us from, you know, what's really important, and the fact that, again, like, human fellowship is the most important thing. So if I would, you know, this is just an idea, I don't know if it's asinine or not, but if all of us, and this is, people call me an idealist, whatever it may be, but of all of, you know, all of the people that currently exist now sought to work together in some shape, form, or fashion, whether it was because of, you know, a public-private partnership, whether it was just to volunteer at school, whether it was just to help kids, whether it was just to help the quote-unquote elderly or, you know, older population, like, we would be a lot further as a society instead of everybody, again, being broken off into factions, as you mentioned, and it being rich versus poor, left versus right, you know, black versus white, however you want to, you know, conceive of it. But again, like I said, this is what I get into all the time as a human rights activist.
And I think at the core of it, we're all either in search of a home, or, you know, we all just want to call a place home, right? We all do. Everyone in this room, everyone on this earth, we're all looking for a home. That's it. And we all want to be seen, and we all want to be heard. Those are like the fundamental things that we're all looking for. We just want to be human. And if we can just remember that, I mean, I think if we could just start there. And I think that's why this conversation is so important, because we're looking at all these different categories of individuals, right? If you're in the homeless population, if you're stateless, if you're undocumented, if you're in foster care, right? And even if we're not part of these communities and never have them, we've all been in search for a home or wanting to call a place home or feel like we're at home. So we can just remember that. I think that's just like such an important place to start.
I agree. Definitely agree. So before we get to our question and answer session, I'm going to ask a two-part question, which is basically going to be a combination of the last two questions that I have, but they're really similar but distinct, if you will. So please just bear with me. Again, so considering our conversation, I think that you may have alluded to some of this before, but considering the conversation and your experience institutionally, now we're talking again, like, you know, higher level, which is again, I think why we're all here, considering United Nations Day, considering both public, the first part of this question, considering both public and private institutions, and the role of agencies such as United Stateless, what, I guess, advice or takeaways or recommendations in terms of policy would you like to share with not only our audience but the international community in terms of the role that public and private partners, institutions play?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think we got a 5-minute time warning, so I'll try to make this brief. You know, there are a lot of things. I mean, I think, you know, on a more practical level, I think that we need to have more voices of individuals who are in those marginalized communities speaking on behalf of the policies that are being put in place, right? Usually we've got economists, we have historians, we have all these people, but we don't have the people who are actually going through it. I think that if we had those voices and we also had the perspective of people who've gone through it and come out of it, survivors, like, let's look at that. Let's look at what we can replicate, right? What worked for them and how can we replicate that? The answers are right there. So I think that's another thing that we can do. And also, not getting rid of or getting out of this whole, you know, creating this perception of the dichotomy of like superhuman and subhuman within these categories, right? There's always this superhuman homeless person who got out of it because they were extraordinary, so they're unreachable, or they're subhuman and they're a menace to society, right? Well, as long as we keep focusing on these two dichotomies with each of these categories of marginalized people, it's not attainable, and we continue to dehumanize them. As far as policy goes, I would say that, you know, when we look at these structures and these organizations, whether it's the UN or any other organization, maybe thinking about, you know, who are we holding the staff people, the people who are working there, more accountable, because there are a lot of ethical violations we know with CBP, ICE, right? Holding them accountable. Right now, I don't know if we're doing that, you know, if it's foster care workers, whatever, holding them accountable. Secondly, looking at the most senior leadership in these organizations and really looking at whether or not there's diversity, there's representation, sufficient representation at the most senior levels, or is it the same people in the most senior roles that are making the decisions, right? I think that's really important as well. So yeah,
Thank you.
What to say.
Thank you. So with that being said,